Welcome to the Beau Show. Today I will be speaking with Jason Miller. Jason is the CEO of Gettr, a non-biased free speech social media platform that began in July of 2021. He was formerly a spokesman for Donald Trump in 2016 and a senior advisor to Donald Trump's 2020 re-election campaign. Gettr is one of several social media platforms to emerge after the censorship and free speech suppression on other platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. Platforms like Gettr, Gab, Parler, and Truth Social have entered the marketplace to offer conservatives and free speech advocates alike a place to share ideas without fear of arbitrary suppression that clearly had an impact on the 2020 election and the bombshell of Facebook and Twitter suspending Donald Trump from their respective platforms in an unprecedented move. Now that Elon Musk is in the process of purchasing Twitter and perhaps changing things there, I wanted to speak to Miller about the progress of Gettr and how he sees the social media landscape. I hope you enjoy this interview. Well, Jason Miller, thank you so much for joining me today. You founded Gettr just about a year ago, and not even a year ago, actually pretty close to it. And I spoke to one of your colleagues, Kaylin Dorr, a few months ago at CPAC, and it seems Gettr has really taken off. Can you tell me about Gettr's origins and its development?
Absolutely. Well, as we saw in 2020, it was really the worst year for political discrimination in U.S. history. And probably the most egregious example was the Hunter Biden laptop scandal, which was not only hushed up, but there, I believe, was a collusion between big tech social media platforms and the media to keep that out of the public eye. But it wasn't just purely politics or about 2020. If you go earlier in the year, as we had essentially the rise and the spread of COVID, we were seeing people sentenced to digital jail simply for criticizing Dr. Anthony Fauci, or for saying that the virus came from a lab in Wuhan. Things of this nature that somehow would get people sentenced and put off to a place where they were kicked off a platform or they're put in some aspect of timeout. And then, of course, there was President Trump being completely deplatformed after January 6th. And so coming out of that, I was still working for President Trump in his post-presidency. I started sitting down with Dan Scavino and other members of the team and chatting with folks who were starting to develop platforms, and went through about several dozen different presentations. And when I saw Gettr, I knew that this was the best technology, very much identified with the shareholders' belief in taking down the CCP. The communist oppression in China is something that's not only could lead the U.S. and China towards a kinetic conflict, but is also something that enslaves essentially hundreds of millions of free Chinese people. And so really that message of freedom, that message of democracy, that message of free speech is what then brought me together, and why I decided to launch it then on July 4th, our Independence Day.
And it seems to have really taken off ever since. I mean, you've got a lot of followers, a lot of people using the platform. Let's talk about the devil. Not Kamala Harris, Jason, but Elon Musk, or to some people, he is the devil, for at least for opponents of free speech. How certain were you that his purchase of Twitter would go through?
Oh, I'm not certain that it's going to go through at all. So just to back up, I've been critical of Elon Musk this week, but I very much support what he's trying to do. I think anyone who's trying to pull power away from these Silicon Valley tech oligarchs and return it back to us, or force some of these big platforms to stop using political discrimination in picking winners and losers in the free speech debate, is a good thing. Now, obviously, I'm running Gettr, as you can't tell from the logos behind me. Yeah. And so we're obviously a marketplace competitor. We're smaller, but we're rapidly growing, 5.5 million users. Here's the thing with Elon Musk where I was critical this week. Number one, I'm not convinced this deal ultimately goes through. I know he says it'll be 3 months. Wall Street Journal says even if it's a rocket ship type effort, you're more like 6 months, which means any of these changes to Twitter will be after the midterm elections. We saw what they did in 2020. We don't want to have the same thing happen in 2022. But also, I thought that this deal is so heavily leveraged. I've never seen a buyout that was so heavily leveraged. I'm not sure if the terms of the deal work. The fact of the matter is Twitter stock is 12% below what his offered price was. You look at how much they're having to borrow just to be able to go and fund this leveraged buyout. I'm just not sure if the economics are there. So not sure if it goes through. But here's the thing that jumped out at me this week with his comments that Musk would allow President Trump to return to Twitter. Yeah. Number one, if he really had a strong conviction about that, he probably would have said it over the past month or month and a half. But if you read the full text of his comments, or if you saw the video, you'll see that at the end, Musk came back and said, "But President Trump has said he's not coming back. He's sticking with Truth Social." So it's kind of a moot point. There was not the full-throated embrace of President Trump by any stretch, but I think most of the headlines gave the impression that Musk has this deep burning desire to bring him back. And the final thing to this point that I'll say is that Musk did not sound like someone who, on a principled stand, wants to bring back President Trump. What he sounded like is that he's upset that President Trump is potentially taking millions of users away from Twitter. And that's a much different defense than we have to make sure this man, the former president, maybe future president, has his free speech rights.
Do you think that he'll go back to Twitter? I mean, I know you know him, you have worked for him, you've been a campaign advisor to him. What do you think the chances are that he does go back to Twitter, and how would that affect Gettr and Truth Social if he did?
Well, a couple of things here. So obviously, if President Trump were to return to Twitter, that wouldn't be happening anytime soon. In fact, it probably wouldn't even be this calendar year. It might be something going into next year. I do think that President Trump, if he decides to run for president in 2024, which I believe he does, then he's going to want to be on as many social media platforms as possible. You know, he had 88 million followers on Twitter. Obviously, he'd want to get back on all the platforms. But I don't think that's a decision President Trump needs to make right now. I think that with regard to Gettr specifically, the way that we've diversified and live streaming is such a big deal for us. We're up to over 100 million live stream views on Gettr just since last October. We have some great shows. Obviously, Epoch Times is broadcasting. Folks like Steve Bannon, Dinesh D'Souza. I host an evening show called Miller Live that we do at 7 p.m. And so not only do we have the live stream, but we're also launching on June 1 Vision, which is our short video component that'll be a competitor actually to TikTok and Instagram Reels. So if you enjoy TikTok or Instagram Reels, but you don't want your data going to the CCP, and you don't want political discrimination to come and play, then you're going to really like what we launched with Vision.
Jason, now that Truth Social is up and running, and it was certainly problematic, I know that firsthand. I think a lot of people experienced that. Do you see the free speech market becoming crowded now? I mean, you had Gab, there was Parler, there's Gettr, there's Truth Social. That's great. And maybe even Elon's purchase of Twitter, like you said, should it go through. Is it getting crowded now? How does Gettr punch through that? You just mentioned a couple of great new additives that Gettr will have, or do you kind of root for each other?
So two things can be true at the same time here. I think that from in kind of an ideological or fundamental philosophical perspective, more competition is better. The fact that things are never going to be as centralized as they were during the 2020 election is something that we should all strive for. Never again should we want one single company controlling so much of the ability for free speech, because then they can just literally turn it off. They can flip the switch or turn the spigot, and all of a sudden there's no free speech, or the Hunter Biden laptop story doesn't get out. So it's critical that we have a number of pathways. Let's just say hypothetically, President Trump was offered his Twitter account back and he returned. Who's to say that he doesn't get a month or two down the road and Twitter doesn't decide to reverse that? And then where would we have another platform? Where would we have another place to go? The one thing I would point out, a massive distinction right now, is of the platforms that you named, we're the only one, for example, that is on the Google Play Store. We're the only one right now that has full functionality for the Apple Store. The Google Play Store is on all of the apps, is something that you can actually access from your phone. And so that's a big deal. I mean, just in the US, when you look at Trump voters, they're roughly about 58% or so use Google or Samsung phones, but only about 39% are really in the Apple category. But as you look around the world, take Brazil, for example, our second largest market. It's 87% Google or Samsung phones. And so the ability to be on all the platforms really gives us that opportunity to scale. And I think that sets us apart from some of the competitors.
Good answer, Jason. Let's go back to the Hunter Biden laptop story for a moment. Now, big tech obviously had an enormous role in censoring significant true stories like the Biden laptop. They hide behind Section 230. We've talked about that for many years, of course, and that not being revised. How significant do you think, Jason, that suppression was, as well as the Trump re-election campaign suppression for sharing that story leading up to the election? How significant do you think it was?
Yeah, great question. So when you have 44,000 votes over 3 states deciding a presidential election, any little thing is close. It could have been a particular rally or a press conference or a news cycle in the run up to the election. In fact, the way that we closed so strong in 2020, a lot of people say if the election had been 1 week later, then President Trump would have won. A lot of people say if the election had been 1 week earlier in 2016, President Trump would have lost. So when it's that close, and to put it in perspective, I believe the spread was 77,000 votes over 6 states when we look back to 2016. And so we're talking about very narrow, very small margins here. But specific to the Hunter Biden laptop, post-election polling done by the Media Research Center showed that 1 out of every 6 Biden voter would have reconsidered their vote if they knew the foreign business ties. And here's the thing. I know we talked about the laptop, Beau, and of course there's a desire to go and look at the feather boa picture, or Hunter and 1 or 2 ladies and multiple cameras. It's a family program, so I won't go into the details. There's a tendency for us to kind of the moth to the flame on that because it's scandalous. Yeah, and that's kind of the noise, not the signal. The issue here were the international business dealings and the fact that Joe Biden stood on that debate stage and said he had never discussed his son's business with them. That was a lie. And not only are there serious business dealings in China, you look at the mess we're in right now with Russia invading Ukraine, which I firmly oppose, and that's an unlawful invasion. But you look at that mess, and then you look at the business interest in the Biden family that could be influencing some of that, the talk of 10% for the big guy. There are a lot of troubling things where you have to wonder what are the true motivations between this administration's policies on China and Ukraine.